Okay, hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Wherever in the world you may be, thank you for joining us for advocacy training. Some of you may have joined us before for this program. It might be new to some of you. Either way, we're really excited to have all of you here with us. And we're going to get started in just a moment. We have a couple of things to get through before we get to the main content of our session today. But as we are waiting for people to join us, go ahead, introduce yourselves in the chat. Let me first make sure that the chat is uh, available to everybody. Okay, now you can go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from, how old you are, and then just this icebreaker question, just to get everybody started. What is your favorite body of water and why? I would say my favorite body of water is probably the Sargasso Sea, which is off the east coast of Florida here in the States. And that is just my favorite body of water because that's where I grew up. Spending a lot of time in that water over there with all of the Atlantic Caribbean species. It's really meaningful to me. So yeah, go ahead, introduce yourselves. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, we got France, South Sudan, the United Kingdom, Trinidad and Tobago, Ghana, Sri Lanka, the Philippines. Wow, another one from the UK. This is awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Tunisia, Michigan here in the States, Canada. Wow, this is awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I hope it's not too late, too early for all of you who are joining us from kind of tricky time zones. I know that this timing cannot work for everybody in the world all at the same time. And I'm happy to let you know that the next iteration of youth advocacy training that we will be hosting after the new year, sometime in February and March, will be held at a different time of day. So hopefully it works a little bit better for some of you in those time zones that currently are a little late or a little early. But yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us. It's so awesome to see so many people from so many different places. We're going to go ahead and get started here. So just to go over our agenda for the day, I'm going to give you a little introduction in just a moment. We're going to have our wonderful speaker introduce himself. We'll get into the discussion. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end. On that note, be sure to use the Q&A feature at any point throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, hopefully we'll have time to answer them at the end. And yeah, that should cover the agenda here. So again, for those of you who are new to advocacy training, welcome. We are so happy to have you. This program has been in progress since 2022. It has been a really awesome opportunity for young people all over the world. You can see down here, we have had the ability to reach over 2,000 young people from 120 plus countries over the last 2.5 years. So it's really, really awesome to have you all with us today. This program, if you are joining us, you've probably read a little bit about it. You know what you're getting into, but we are basically going to be developing and refining the skills in your personal toolbox of practical advocacy skills to make sure that you have confidence in yourself, in your ability to host conservation campaigns, initiatives, and projects in your own communities. So you'll have the chance to talk with our expert speakers, have discussions, interact in the Q&A section, and hopefully develop a good, strong foundation for all of your future advocacy efforts. All of the training content is developed in collaboration with our panelist speakers that we have during the current program, during previous programs and in collaboration with our World Ocean Day Youth Advisory Council. Today is actually very special. We do have several members of our World Ocean Day Youth Advisory Council joining us today for these sessions, and hopefully they will be able to add some insights in their Q&A and in the chat as well. So here we are, session 1, the ocean climate connection. So with advocacy training, this is always the first session. And we chose the ocean climate connection specifically because in 2024, World Ocean Day launched our new multi-year action theme, which is catalyzing action for the ocean and climate. So all of the things that we do throughout the year, not just on World Ocean Day on the 8th of June, but all throughout the year, is all to do with causing collective action for the ocean and climate to grow this global movement 365 days a year, not just on World Ocean Day. And all 12 months of the year have their own specific themes. For October, it is protecting Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And next month for November, that is implementing 30 by 30, which is the campaign to preserve and protect 30% of the world's waters, ocean, and land by 2030. So we are going to be talking a lot about all of this today. But first of all, just a quick introduction for myself. My name is Laura Johnson. I am the Youth Programs Manager for the Ocean Project. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about myself. We also have Jiyun Lee, who is our Global Outreach Partner today, Global Outreach Coordinator. She's on with us here helping facilitate as well. And then of course, we have our wonderful guest speaker, Armand Alex, who is the co-founder of the Gulf of Mexico Youth Climate Summit. He's from Texas. This is actually the 3rd time that he has been a speaker with us for advocacy training. And every time I get to chat with him, it's always a really, really wonderful discussion. He has so many awesome experiences that he has had throughout his career, and especially impressive for someone who is younger than I am. Armand, I will go ahead and pass it off to you so you can introduce yourself. You are 24, 25, yes?
Yeah, birthday is coming up on December 13th. I'm hitting the big quarter of 100.
Happy early birthday.
Thanks, I appreciate it, Laura. I want to say thank you for inviting me back, and the sentiments you've offered are incredibly mutual. I'm also very thankful. Gian is participating and sharing space with us as well, and thank you to the advisory council for also having this space with speakers and offering your input to help design advocacy as well. But yeah, my name is Armand Alex. As Laura mentioned, I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas, so-called Corpus Christi. These are the lands of the Guancua, the Coilatecan, and the Lipan Apache. But truthfully, there were a lot of indigenous groups that migrated throughout these areas and called them home. So I'm sure that there are a few that I am missing, all of which are important to the advocacy that I do here locally. A lot of my work you'll see is done locally, but then it also, I'm really big on advocating for international collaboration whenever it comes to organization, both in the NGO space, nonprofit spaces, and actual institutions. And so it's really of that mindset of thinking globally and acting locally and vice versa. So thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, Armand, I'm really excited for this discussion. So jumping right in. So we're all here for a reason. We all are a big fan of the planet and the ocean and climate, as I'm sure most of you are pretty intimately familiar with, are connected through their physical, biological, and ecological processes. But the ocean and climate spaces can feel very distinctly separate at times. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. There's a lot of different conversations to be had about that. But for you, Armand, where do you see advocacy kind of bridging that gap between those two spaces? Are there any specific areas of advocacy that you feel are an effective way, excuse me, to bring ocean and climate advocacy together?
I think this is a really big one. And a lot of what I keep going back to as of recent, activities that I've been up to just here within the Corpus Christi area, I think about the usefulness of education. It's reminding people about the facts, right? We know that since, gosh, the 1970s, the ocean has absorbed somewhat nearly 90% of excess heat generated by greenhouse gases, that are produced by the burning of fossil fuels. That's a fact. And they have the ocean plays a really big integral role of regulating our global climate. That is a fact. And when we spend time sharing these pieces under this education umbrella with the folks that are immediately close to us, our friends and our families, I know sometimes those conversations can be difficult. Not everyone has the same point of view or have access to the same bits of information. But if we are grounded as a community in which the facts are laid out by experts that do these scientific processes to find out this information, that plays a really big role in bridging the gap of understanding how our ocean is connected to regulating our climate. It is not the only solution that we have, but it is a large one of this bigger puzzle that we're putting together to help solve this climate crisis.
Yeah,
I think
Armand.
that,
So
sorry,
sorry,
go ahead,
go
Laura.
ahead. No, you go ahead. You finish.
We're too nice. I was also going to add that one of the other bigger things that come into play here as well is it's not just the way in which our ocean plays a factor in these things. I think one of the items that we'll get to later is the carbon tunnel vision as well. But I don't want to step into that space just quite yet. I think you may have had a thought as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do really appreciate that the comment that you made about the sense of community and leaning on people who are aware of the facts. That is definitely something that is important to do, and especially like wherever in the world you are. I know that this is another thing that we'll touch on in a little bit. It can look very, very different. The general acceptance of the issues that are happening, but it's all about making that connection to the outside world, to the place that we live. And it doesn't necessarily matter what your political affiliation is or your personal beliefs. If you like to breathe clean air, this is something that you should be concerned about. So before we move on to the next one, I'm just wondering if you have any specific examples of successful collaboration between ocean climate, either specific advocates or campaigns or initiatives or anything like that.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones comes to mind around the 30 by 30. This isn't a particularly new topic. A lot of work has been going into, protecting 30% of our world's ocean by the year 30, by the year 2030, and many different organizations, institutions, coalitions in this collaborative space have adopted this to be more subjective to the work that they're doing. But overall, there's been an international push around protecting 30% of the world's waters by 2030. What we have seen in bits and pieces of that going into local work, specifically here within the US, we've seen the current administration doing their own version of 30 by 30, America the Beautiful, here within the US. And that was done by the advocacy of young people, both within the ages of 25 to 15. Even younger than that, because I've been able to participate in some community events, and you had folks in K through 12, high school, middle school, and elementary kids who understand that the ocean plays a big role in this. And I think that this is another example of where we were able to advocate to, specifically lawmakers, that the ocean plays a big role. Our waters and the upkeep of those, the maintenance and the stewardship around protecting our waters goes hand in hand with mitigating the climate crisis. And again, I'll go back to just the facts. I think that another alarming fact that I learned recently was through the most recent IPCC report, noting that I think it was the top 700 meters, top 700 meters of the ocean. There are parts that are even deeper, have warmed by 0.18% degrees Celsius each year, per decade since 1971 or so. But that's significant. That is a lot of warming. And it is because the burning of fossil fuels. And one way to mitigate that is through ocean-based climate solutions, which young people understand because they're getting educated. And we're taking that the science, the facts, the information, the real world impacts to frontline communities into the spaces where we're advocating for ocean-based climate solutions. And we've seen, even on an international level here within the US, this current administration listened to the youth and has taken action. Now, I will say it's not always enough, it's never enough, but it was a step forward. And compared to progress, the lack of progress years past, this is a good step forward, but there's always, room for more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that, the points that you made are not only really great examples of blending between ocean and climate spaces and advocacy initiatives, but it's also interdisciplinary and intergenerational. And there's so many different ways that different groups of people can come together on these issues because, again, it's something I think the ocean essentially, I don't know if it's 60%, 70%. The ocean provides like half of the oxygen we breathe. So it's
Yeah.
literally every other breath that we take. Um, the ocean is basically responsible for. So it doesn't even matter if you live in a coastal community or not. You can live, I saw somebody in the chat earlier. We have somebody from the States in Michigan that is super, super landlocked, way inland.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter where you are. The ocean still is important for our global well-being. So moving on from this and going back to what you had mentioned before, carbon tunnel vision.
Oh, yeah.
I will shout out Future Earth. This is a great graphic. I've used this in sessions many times. I think it's a really awesome visual to kind of explain what we're talking about here. Um, like you mentioned, Armand, there are a lot of different ecological issues other than carbon emissions that need our focus, but the solutions for those other issues can also impact carbon emissions as well without necessarily that just being the one solution that we're looking like carbon capture. That's like one specific area of technology advancement for these multi crises, but that, only focus on that one issue. So, how can we actually utilize the ocean? You were talking about ocean based climate solutions a little bit earlier, but how can we start to shift the narrative around carbon emissions and carbon tunnel vision to kind of address the role that ocean solutions play in all of this?
Yeah, I think this is actually a very important thing for our generation to have a better understanding of what carbon tunnel vision is. And I think that this may have been, I wouldn't necessarily say a mistake, but certainly was, of advocacy efforts throughout various environmental organizations years past, just to focus on carbon emissions. And I will say, though, I do think that it plays a large part in solution on mitigating the amount of carbon into our atmosphere, but it certainly isn't going to be the only thing that we should be investing efforts in as youth and understanding the larger picture. Whenever it comes to saving our planet, there are a lot of crises that you mentioned, Laura, excuse me. And the way that I frame this is not everyone is going to gravitate towards carbon emission work. A lot of folks have, a passion for biodiversity. A lot of folks may have passion for just water or specific to corals and ocean acidification. This graphic is wonderful, by the way, because it really does offer a lot of the spaces in which there are investments in. And you said another word around multidisciplinary. And I think that this work to save our planet requires multifaceted approaches. So there needs to be focus on carbon. There needs to be focus on overconsumption. There needs to be focus on the fashion industry as well as biodiversity loss. And the facts remain for each of these. We know that since, oh gosh, pre-industrial times, that the ocean's surface acidity has increased by nearly 30% due to CO2 absorption alone. And we know that directly in the space of biodiversity loss and acidification of our oceans, it it harms the calcifying organisms. A lot of this is familiar to folks that are really detailed in this, but if it's your first time, this may be something new to you, in which when there's more acidification in our oceans, it affects those calcifying organisms on a chemistry-based level of their makeup, such as corals, something as simple as corals and oysters. That's here in my hometown, here in Corpus Christi, we have a lot of oysters. And when we see more acidification of our ocean, and that is something very specific, but it is also something that needs to be addressed because, of course, that goes into carbon. But there's also thing like another one I had mentioned was the overconsumption. It We do have to rethink the ways in which we consume. And again, I don't say that to take away from this bigger picture. Like one of the biggest things is needing to mitigate how much carbon we have into our atmosphere. There's a lot of conversation around straying away from what we do independently, and not putting the blame or the pressure on us as individuals, but really naming who perpetrators of the climate crisis are, and that is fossil fuels. But I just recently read a book by one of my favorite artists, authors, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. What happens if we get it right? What if we get it right? And she's written a lot of books. But within that spirit of her writing, it is very much if we get it right, we are able to cut down on our dependence on fossil fuels. How are we going to act afterwards? Are we going to fall into the same habits that led us here? So in this process now, whether we're talking about health or education or ecotoxicity or overconsumption or the inequalities, we do need to take the time to reflect on ourselves to see what we can do to change our habits now to fit the future that is just and sustainable as well. So I love thinking outside of just the carbon tunnel vision. Thanks for including this today as well, Laura.
Yeah, Armand, I ditto to everything that you literally just said because it I don't know how to even like succinctly like reiterate what you just went over because it's so overarching and it just is so wonderful to have this discussion. I hope that our audience are kind of thinking about this in terms of how you can start to think about the changes that you can make in your own communities to kind of address some of these things that we're talking about. So for our next question here, how can different sectors, like you mentioned, help bring attention to ocean and climate policy, and how can policymakers support this integration? So, Armand, you kind of already did go over how some of that can happen, but I'm interested to see if you have a perspective on the way that young people can kind of have some power in that discussion.
Yeah. I think another big thing that our generation has been a lot more effective than others is our attention to mental health. And I think that this is something to keep in mind as we continue to do our advocacy around these issues, because it would be important for us to take in and read as much as we can about the issues, not just related to the climate crisis, but the other inequities that we're seeing that are driving the climate crisis as well. And so when I think about how we are able to, as advocates, tie these things together, it's just finding the connection points. Our overconsumption, say for instance, in the space of fast fashion, we know that that requires energy, not just from people power, but then also from equipment. And the use of those equipments need energy. Where does that energy come from? Is it related to fossil fuels? Is that fossil fuel, emitting carbon into the atmosphere? So like there's connection points through all of this. And, as much as I am aware of our individual capacity, our need for the sensitivity of being mindful of anxieties, of feeling overwhelmed by a lot of these daunting facts. I do think it is important for us as advocates in our own way to find these connection points so that as other other issues come up, you're able to see how to navigate through that. Like, what is the through line of all of those items, all of those issues? And specifically here at home, we were able to work within the Corpus Christi City Council around pushing forward for some sustainability budget items. It was originally proposed at 8. We had to settle for 4 because there were some outside opposed organizations. I'll go into those details. But what was interesting about those conversations when we sat down with the city manager's office was that we understood that sustainability goes across many different sectors. Of course, in our minds, as an organization, was the Gulf Reach Institute, we were thinking about mitigating the climate crisis. But what does that mean subjectively to here within our hometown of Corpus Christi, Texas, given the state of politics in the state of Texas and its barriers around environmental work? What can we do here locally? It's through planting trees. All right, we can do that. It's through we spoke to birders within our area who are saying, hey, there are too many lights in the city during the nighttime. Can we put some shades to keep the light just on the streets and not into the sky? We included that in the budgeting as well. I think a really big piece of the advocacy that we also have to do is have adaptability and be inclusive of other sectors that are involved in these. And together, if I'm doing this work here in Corpus and Sophie is doing her work in somewhere else and Laura's doing your work and Gian, you're doing your work and Karam and Stanley and Ruth, they're all doing their work from different places across the world or here in the US, we're still pushing towards mitigating the climate crisis in our own individual ways. And by doing so, that meets what I was talking about earlier in terms of how do we shift our behaviors and our routines as a humanity to fit that just and sustainable world as well.
I could listen to you talk about this all day, Armand, honestly. Yeah, I honestly I don't really feel like I have anything to add to that because it's just such a wonderful overview of what we're talking about here. And I also want to shout out Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson one more time because one of the things that you had mentioned was just finding what it is that you can do in your community. And I'm going to move to the next slide because we're going to talk about intersectionality here. And this does kind of lead us into this, but um, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson kind of utilized this concept. I believe it's called ikigai. I'm sorry if I'm totally pronouncing that wrong. It's a Japanese concept, I believe, of how to find like the most fulfilling life. And it's something called the climate Venn diagram. Jiyun, if you could find that link and see if you could drop it in the chat so we can share that with folks, that would be awesome. It's just a really great resource that I love to share with people because it allows them to kind of look at their life in a holistic way. What is important to you? What do you enjoy doing? And what are you good at? And taking all of that into account in terms of what you are able to do to help solve all of these
Mm.
different issues. And on that note, because we have all of these things going on at the same time all around the world, kind of one of the things that you had already mentioned in terms of, mental health. Oh my gosh. Actually, we do have a public webinar coming up in December all about youth climate activist mental health. So stick around and stay tuned for updates about that. But just reading here, each of us has a specific level of privilege that is different from those around us, both in terms of the direct impact that all of these issues are having on our own lives, but also a level of privilege in our individual ability to offer help and solutions for a just and equitable future, which really means a just and equitable future for all. It doesn't count as a just and equitable future if it is not for everybody. So this is already kind of something that you have touched on a little bit, but how do we ensure that discussions and initiatives and projects and campaigns that are aimed around ocean and climate action are not only inclusive of the people who are disproportionately affected by climate change, but are actually listening to and taking into account the specific needs of those communities?
I don't know if there's necessarily an answer that fits all, but one thing that has been profoundly impactful that I learned during my work with Heirs to Our Ocean, which works with the UN Ocean Decade specifically, is empathetic leadership. And I think that if we learn to understand what empathy means in terms of seeing someone else's shoes and doing this work through a love of humanity and respect of one another, that sets the playing field to genuinely listen to another person and not just to respond afterward, but listen to comprehend, to see yourself in their shoes as best as you can, to empathize with them. And that really does open the door for you to have more of these discussions and be more thoughtful, be more inclusive of the folks that you're collaborating with, whether you're on the front lines yourself or whether you're from a place of maybe perhaps privilege in some sense, but want to do this work. Listening and having empathy for others really does set that playing field for folks. And I had mentioned before, I think that facts are a really big thing. And I think it was the University of Hawaii that they were able to release some study around indigenous and rural communities, specifically across the Pacific Islands, I believe, and which it stated somewhere near like twice they indigenous and rural communities in Pacific Islands are twice at risk of displacement from sea level rise and coastal erosion. So, do you think that it would be important to engage them in conversations around ocean based climate solutions if they're on the front lines? That's a fact. Twice the risk of displacement from sea level rise. And I really want to drill that home because what does that actually mean? What does being displaced from sea level rise actually mean? Because we've actually seen within our lifetime, within our own life, entire cultures on islands where they have lived there for generations and generations completely wiped. They had to relocate their moms, their dads, their children, their grandmothers to a completely different place, not because that they were contributing to the climate crisis, when we know that actually it is countries like the U.S. and other larger GDP countries that are contributing the most to the climate crisis, whereas frontline communities are incredibly less contributing to what we're seeing happening around the world in terms of the climate impacts. Another thing that I remember reading not that long ago was an EPA report around communities of color right here within the US, where we know that communities of color specifically are disproportionately affected by both climate related hazards, but then also the exposure of fossil fuel burning as well. They face nearly 50% higher exposure to air pollution than other communities that are not related to communities of color. And they are exposed more to frequent extreme weather events as well when compared to their counterpart demographics. And that is quite unfortunate. So you're right. I think it is important for us to think about the ways in which this work needs to be more intersectional because there is a lot of injustices around social, economic, and political issues. And it's not just the US. And I think that a lot of the conversations happen to be a little bit more biased and from the POV of folks in the US. And that is, unfortunate. And that is something that we have to keep in mind as we do more of this work and being intersectional, listening to voices from the global South and those on the front lines, because this is everything to them. And I know there are probably a lot of folks in the meeting as well today that are listening in, and you may be on the front lines as well. And I want to remind those folks because I come from a city in which we have the third largest port in the U.S. We are also the number one exporter of liquefied natural gas. We are also the number one importer of crude oil here within the Corpus Christi port. And we have 14 miles of refinery road, nothing but industry. And I too have had loss of family members and friends because of the exposure to fossil fuel. And I think that our voices matter. And I think it is important for us to continue to advocate for these real world impacts that we feel so that others can understand. And it is not just at the intersection of fossil fuel burning, but government corruption as well. We've seen across the world a real taxing on the lack of empathy in regards to other humans. And it's something for us to have conversations as, because all of these things are connected.
Yeah, Armand, thank you so much for that. And I do really appreciate you acknowledging um, those of us, folks in the audience who have experienced that, who are potentially on the front lines themselves. I see some folks here in the chat who are talking about this a little bit. And I live in Los Angeles. This is the number one and number two largest port in the
Mm,
country, and I live very close to that. I woke up in the middle of the night last night because I heard foghorns and they were going off, and the port is miles away from here, and sound pollution is something that we don't even
yeah.
like really think about that much. Um, but it's also critically important to acknowledge the fact that, climate refugees already exist in a lot of spaces that we're having these higher level conversations about, what are we going to do when people get displaced? And some of those conversations are still being framed around if people get displaced.
Mm.
It's not actively currently happening right now. And I think that's also an important thing to kind of think about as we're moving in these conversations. Um, Now, you also mentioned some of the stuff that you've already mentioned kind of also covers these next questions. So I'm going to kind of combine them here because you've already talked at length and in such a beautiful way about how environmental justice can kind of bring the ocean
Mm.
climate spaces together again, because everybody in the world needs the ocean, regardless of where we live, regardless of who you are, where you come from. Um, and you've also talked a lot about community-based approaches to bridge that gap and contribute to overall resilience of not just the environment, but the community itself. And you've given so many awesome statistics. I feel like I'm learning so much just from listening to you talk. But I also want to mention the statistic that I think it's um, Indigenous peoples are responsible for protecting something like 80% of the world's biodiversity. I
Mhm.
may have phrased that slightly incorrect me. Don't quote me on that. I'm fairly certain that's what that statistic is. But it really just kind of underscores your point about making sure that the folks who are, you know, disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change are given the opportunity and are made sure to be leading these conversations, because not only are they being disproportionately affected by them, they are also in many ways disproportionately responsible for a lot of the ecological processes on this planet, and that's just too much burden to bear. So I do want to kind of talk about these community-based approaches. I do also want to make sure we can get to, I think, let me just check the next one. Okay. This is, we have one more section of questions about youth
Yeah,
involvement,
sure.
but I also want to make sure we have time for the Q&A. So kind of bridging this question about community-based approaches, utilizing that gap, and then moving that into the youth involvement side of things. Um, we've already kind of talked about how all of these different processes look really different in different places. And you've mentioned so many different amazing things. I feel like every time we have a conversation about this stuff, the whole thing could just be its own like webinar series. It's great.
Sure.
Um, but how does the fact that these processes look so different impact our ability to have collective action? I know that that's kind of a tricky question to
Mm.
answer because there are so many different variables, but and it is also kind of a straightforward answer in some ways as well, because obviously if things don't work the same, like it's tough. But what does that look like to you personally? Have you experienced any of that in your work? Have you had peers experience that? And how do we kind of navigate our way around that as young people in this space?
Yeah, earlier I had mentioned about naming names and shooting for, when we're addressing a lot of these inequities around the world, aiming for the roots and not just the symptoms. And one of those big things being around the climate crisis, fossil fuel burning. And so in my community, that means a lot. And I've been able to participate in work related to international pushback on LNG, liquefied natural gas. And for a quick context around that, because I know we're tight on time, um, the fossil fuel industry has done it again, in which they've convinced nations around the world that a transition to LNG is going to be the transition we need that is going to save us from this climate crisis. It's false. Once again, we're witnessing the same playbook from the fossil fuel industry in which they are touting their own solution with their own profits in mind. It works for them, does not work for the global humanity at large. So that being said, this has been a space that is particularly interesting to my community because we know we're the number one exporter of LNG. So we're exporting liquefied natural gases. And if we're exporting them, that means they have to be going somewhere. So where are they going? And it's going to Europe. So we have been able to work with our friends and colleagues from Europe. We're working on pushing back on exports here in the US. They're working on pushback on the imports of LNG in their communities as well. But the processes in the government around how we navigate pushback politically here within the US are definitely different than what they do in various places in Europe. So there's this real example of us having a lot of trust. And there's no expectation on my part living here for me to be an expert in various European governmental processes. That you can take an entire course on just that, and it would take forever to understand. But I think what international collaboration around a specific issue for me has done is reminded me that there are people across the world and their particular homes that understand the government, that understand the social political issues going on in their hometown. I am always welcome to learning. I think every advocate should continue to be welcome to learning more, especially what is offered and being curious and asking questions. But trust in the colleagues across the world that are doing this work in their hometowns and work with them. It's back again to those pieces of listening. Earlier, the question was around how do we incorporate environmental justice practices into this? And I think it's very relevant to this work around us as global youth leaders. When we do our work based in principles and morals and sound ethics, we know that we're stepping off on the right foot. And another good piece of information that comes to my mind is democratic principles of organizing, in which another one is operating from the space that everyone is trying to take a step forward in good faith. And I think there are so many on that list that come to my mind. But I know one thing's for certain. What does the world look like when we listen to our colleagues and our friends from other perspective places around the world around what success would look like for their community? Because we know, for instance, I think it was the Coastal Research Institute. I think they're on the East Coast, but they said something around like 60%. There's a 60% higher success rate when local communities are actively involved in the planning and the decision-making processes around the projects that they're working on related to climate-related issues. 60% higher success rates, and that's just out of listening to the people that it impacts the most. And so when I think about international collaborations, such as the global plastic treaties and the high seas treaties, those came from a space of higher institutions pushing this work forward. When they began to incorporate youth voices, we were demanding we need to particularly involve more frontline communities, rural communities, and Pacific, and island-based communities as well. And when we did that, we saw more engagement and advocacy from those communities for these particular treaties, and we're seeing progress being made. And so when we think about this global youth movement, we need to incorporate those kind of principles to make sure that international collaboration is effective, but it can only be effective when we consider these voices that are on the front lines.
Absolutely. And I also want to acknowledge somebody in the chat here saying, being an environmentalist in the Philippines is extra challenging. In fact, for the 11th consecutive year in 2024, the Philippines is still declared as the deadliest country in Asia for environmental defenders. And I think that that really drives home the point that the ability of all of us to affect change in our communities looks very, very different depending
Yeah.
on where we live. And that is a legitimately terrifying concept, to think that standing up for the planet is something that your life is potentially in danger for. And I think that to kind of tie a knot and tie a bow around this conversation before we move into the Q&A, I think that a lot of this is it comes down to solidarity. Really,
Mm.
we're not free until we're all free, you know, and thinking about intersectionality and how all of these issues that we have touched on just ever so slightly, that could be their own, like you said, college course on all of these, to like truly understand what's going on. It's all connected. It's all connected. And so that concept that you mentioned right at the beginning, I think when you were introducing yourself, you said something about thinking globally and acting locally. It all really comes down to that. And like you said, if you are acting on principle and you are, you know, really dedicated to the concept of solidarity within the climate space, within the ocean space, but also within socioeconomic equity, within justice, and that, how that relates to everything else as well, we will start to see more and more international collaborations be successful, like the Global Plastics Treaty and the High Seas Treaty, and young people, you know, if you're watching this right now, whether you're in this webinar live or you're watching this recording later, you're in the right place. Being able to learn and like you said, Armand, be a lifelong learner, educate yourself and those around you. That is absolutely the first step. And I'm just really excited to get to the Q&A. I see that we already have some folks here who have asked some really, really awesome questions. Um, let's see here. Where do we want to start? So I see, I actually want to touch on this question from Dakota, who is one of our Youth Advisory Council members from Australia. She asked, how can we effectively recognize and share the voices of Indigenous and underrepresented stakeholders in the climate crisis, ensuring that our efforts amplify their perspectives without unintentionally overshadowing them as a non-Indigenous person? I think that is an awesome question.
Oh yeah, for sure. I would say that there's a couple of things that come to my mind. It's from the perspective of your work. Are you an individual that is doing this individual advocation, or is this you're an organization doing this? But in both parts, it's like, what resources do you have available to you? Do you have the resources in an organization to not just have a phone call and then pass on their words to the team and then have that incorporated into the work? Because there's issues in that. But do you have the resource available to you to invite that person to be a part of your team, to actively involve them through the process on a project or a campaign that they're working in, to hear directly from them so that there is continued inclusion of their voices and perspective? But it's not just this is the impact climate crisis is having to me kind of way of a dynamic, but it should also be if they're willing to offer, here are solutions that my community have seen for these, and how can we either amplify those, grow those, invest in those, or incorporate those into the kind of work that we're advocating for. And on an individual letter, you said it, Laura, it was just being a lifelong learner. There should be a real beauty in wanting to learn more about other cultures in a way that is not exploitative, right? It's not learning about another culture and then taking that information and having some kind of self-fulfilled profit off of it to an extent. But I do think it is important for us to listen, for us to share the words and the voices of those that are speaking on these issues, because not everyone in these particular areas, whether it's indigenous folks or island communities as well, they're not all speaking to this, but the ones that are willing to and going above and beyond to make sure their voice is heard, hold on, like embrace that and engage with them in that kind of perspective. And when you have the opportunity, if you don't identify, again, thanks Dakota for this question, if you don't identify with those marginalized communities, but you're in a space where their voices could be used, then say something, speak up. When you feel as if though there is someone missing from this conversation, speak up, because 9 times out of 10, they've been left out of those conversations historically. And so you may be the one in that particular opportunity to say, hey, it may be a good idea for us to reach out to so and so or someone from this particular community. And I think that if we're willing to take at least some sort of step forward in this space, and if we're all doing that collectively, I think that goes a long way. Depending on who you ask, it's here are some rights and here are some wrongs, here are some do's, here are some don'ts. But I think it's about our intention.
Mm. Hmm. I really, really appreciate what you said, Armand, about it's the power of voice, right? If you, like you said at the end of that, if you notice that there's somebody missing from the conversation who needs to be there, say something. But what you mentioned at the beginning of answering that question also was the fact that even if you are the person to recognize that somebody is missing, you may not be the person who has the ability to bring those members of that community into the conversation. So whether or not you can actually do anything about it, whether you have a contact or family member or friend or a community member who you can ask to join the conversation, even if you don't, the power of saying something and acknowledging the space and the people who are missing from that conversation is still very meaningful in and of itself. So I think that's a great point. Um, Kind of on that note here in terms of what young people can bring and offer to this, we have a question from Lily in the UK, who is working on a project with their school about noise pollution and cetaceans, so whales, dolphins, porpoises. um, and it feels like they're under a lot of pressure. There's a lot of outside influences that are making it seem difficult uh, to have any successful action. So her question here is there any way I can take a step forward or any mitigation or advocacy projects that you're aware of across the globe that can help me advocate for this issue as somebody who feels like they have no voice? Now, I will say I don't personally know of any noise pollution initiatives in the UK. However, so I don't know if we can necessarily answer that question exactly. If anybody knows of anything, please feel free to drop that in the chat. But Lily, I do really like this question because it can apply to so many different aspects of the ocean and climate crisis. So Armand, how can somebody, regardless of the issue that they're focused on, actually take that first step, take action, and participate in mitigation, adaptation, even if they feel like their voice doesn't have that much sway?
Yeah. Um, During my time of studying social movements at university, I think one thing was blaringly clear, that when you have such a massive, when you realize the extent of the issue and the areas that it impacts, and to then change that, potentially put it on its back and have some kind of change, it requires time. In many spaces, this kind of work is not going to be instant gratification. It's one step and then another step. And then hopefully you have multiple people holding your hands and you're walking together, taking steps, and then you're jogging and then you're running. And, I am not aware of particular campaigns around ocean noise pollution out of the UK. Maybe even in the US, I know there are some institutions that are working on the research related to it. Like, we know that it's blaringly clear, and we saw this with the shutdown due to the COVID pandemic, that we were hearing. So when the world practically shut down, there was less ocean traffic, there was less a busy movement from ships and large vessels in the waters in our ocean, that we were hearing noises from so when you took out the noises of ships, you were hearing noises of whales and dolphins that we had never heard before, that our instruments couldn't detect because they were being polluted with the noise of international travel and international shipments. So we know that this is real. This is a very real thing that we are contributing as it ties to overconsumption, as it ties to the fossil fuel industry and needing to import and export these things, again, to find that through line. You got to start somewhere. Is it through pushing back on fossil fuels? Is it through pushing back on overconsumption? Is it through that fast fashion? And if we're able to, peel those apart in your advocacy, maybe there's a campaign somewhere. The other thing that is important is that, as I said before, like these things take time. And at least the first step in many cases is that research, is finding an organization. I'm sorry that I don't have an instant answer around a particular campaign, but I, in my own ways, find my voice when I feel as if I'm equipped with the right information, and then can either partner with an organization or reach out to a friend or a colleague or find some way to advocate for this particular issue. There's so many different tools and things that are available to us. But folks like Laura and myself and Jian and other folks that are in the call today, reach out to one of those, and I bet you they'd be willing to have a conversation about it even further, maybe even collaborate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, we have about 3 minutes left, and there are so many good questions in here. I keep going back and rereading some of them. I hope that we have been able to address some of the questions in here. They're slightly similar to the ones that we've already had. But I do, let's see. We have from Maggie, hi, I'm a teen who would like to help fight the climate crisis and help people who've been affected. Where's the best place to start addressing this massive issue for somebody who has no connections or a voice? First of all, you have a voice. It doesn't matter who you are, you have a voice. It might not feel like that, but you do. And then somebody else also asked a similar question. What are some of the ways that young people can start projects and initiatives in their communities to address the climate crisis in terms of gaining access to workshops, training, resources, support, find, build community in solidarity? And that all has to do with what Armand just talked about. It's all about leaning on the people around you, really continuing to dig and really having that, whatever your gold star is. For me, for a really long time when I was younger, my gold star, my North Star was shark finning. That was the issue to me that I
Yeah.
felt like was really, really important to address. And I just read a statistic that since 2012, I read the statistic a couple of days ago. Since 2012, the rate of shark finning, I know there's that really popular or well-known statistic that we kill over 100 million sharks per year in our oceans. Since 2012, the number of sharks that we have killed per year has decreased by 80%. I did
Wow.
not know that until like last week. And so, I just wrote myself a note as you were talking. There's a phrase that came to mind that I refer to as collective neuroplasticity. And to me, that means thinking about how we form new habits as individuals in our brains in a physiological sense, how our neurons fire synapses and make these new connections and new ways of thinking, how that process actually works on a molecular level inside of our brains is kind of a microcosm for how collective change is made. There's another question in here about how do we address the way that we consume? How do we, the concept of degrowth to people? It's a difficult idea to propose to accept less than what they currently have. It's all about repeated action and consistent messaging and just really following that North Star and making sure that you are doing all of what you can with in your ability, within your capacity to make the world a better place. And if you are doing anything at all to make the world a better place for the people around you, that is enough. In my opinion, that is enough. Um, I don't think that we will have time because we are at the top of the hour to address all of the rest of these questions. However, if you do have things that you would like to talk about, have more questions about, please feel free to shoot me an email, ljohnson@theoceanproject.org. I do want to move on to a couple of quick announcements that we have. I don't want to go too far over, but Armand, do you have any kind of final thoughts on all of this?
Laura, you tied it all together so wonderfully. You do that incredibly well, and it is a gift. Thank you so much for doing that. I'll say one thing to answer someone's question in the chat around the UN Ocean Conference. Currently working on a project with Heirs to Our Ocean around a youth task force developed for the UN Ocean Decade related to ocean research, ocean policy. It's under the UN umbrella, and so we will be unveiling the youth task force there. Don't tell anyone I said that. That's a secret between all of us. But I am working on that project. And the last thing I wanted to say, Laura, something that has been constantly on my mind after these past few months in the work that I do here, both nationally, internationally, and here at home, is it's a wonderful quote by a social justice, labor justice leader. He's died years ago. His name is Cesar Chavez, and he said, "It's never about the fruits. It is always about the people. When you center people in the work that you do across sectors, across intersectionalities, across the world's issues and these crises that we're all feeling and we're all seeing and witnessing in real time in our lives, if you center the people and remain committed to empathetic leadership, you're doing some really good work. And it's just one step that's taken."
Yeah, Armand, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Just to move on to our last little bit of announcements, updates, etc. I do hope that the folks who have joined us today are available for the next 3 weeks as well to join us live for the rest of the program. Today we covered the Ocean Climate Connection, which is a big umbrella, and there's a lot of things that we covered in here, but it's all principles based. The rest of the advocacy training series gets a little bit more specific about specific areas of advocacy. So session 2 next weekend is social media and communications. Jiyun will actually most likely be the one who is leading that session. I may be able to make it. I'm not sure. I will be out of town. But then the weekend after that, I will be back event planning and fundraising. And then the next weekend after that, campaign organizing. So all of the questions that some of you probably have about really specific niche bits of advocacy and in a practical sense, those questions will all be answered throughout the rest of the program. And then we will, there was a question earlier, we will have all of the recordings for all of the sessions uploaded to the World Ocean Day YouTube channel, where you can also check out recordings from past sessions with different speakers, generally the same topics, but it's always a different conversation and always really, really interesting. We will also be sending out a network survey that would be really, really helpful for us to learn more about who we are reaching in the world with our programming, with our emailing lists and all of that. And then here we are with my email up here again. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A that are asking about specific opportunities to get involved with the World Ocean Days Advisory Council and other youth initiatives. Definitely make sure you are subscribed to the Rising Blue Network newsletter. We are sharing dozens of events and opportunities for young people around the world every single month. It's a monthly newsletter. Definitely recommend taking a look. We also are always sharing those same sort of opportunities on the World Ocean Day social media channels as well. If you have something that's going on in your life that you're working on or that you come across, feel free to tag World Ocean Day, share that post with us. We'll see if we can share it because we really want to help facilitate spreading the word as much as we can. So here we are at the end. I want to just say thank you once again to Armand. I loved this conversation. I feel like, again, I feel like I say this every time you're on one of our webinars as a speaker. I feel like this whole thing could be its own series because I so both on a personal level and in the sense that I'm just so grateful that you're able to speak to our audience. It's just so fulfilling to have these conversations with you, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your weekend to join us here today.
Thank you, Laura. Likewise, incredibly likewise.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed this session. For the World Ocean Day Youth Advisory Council members, we do have our 30 minutes of collaboration space, which is a separate link. Be sure to check our group WhatsApp and Instagram group chat so you can make sure you have that link. But to everybody else, we will see you next weekend. Bye.